our school systems are funded through a tax-based system, which means that underfunded schools exist in poor communities. And we know that poor communities at that time and continuing are largely Black and brown because of lack of opportunity. And so we still had this unequal public school system, and the whole school to prison pipeline narrative comes from that we're looking at third grade success rates in order to figure out how many prisons to build in the late 1990s and 2000s. Prison comes in this particular place. When the mass incarceration of Americans started to happen at the end of the Industrial Revolution, that weird period between having all of these jobs that needed laborers, the migration from the South, laborers were flooding into the North like crazy. High levels of education weren't really needed, but public schools were available to children. But there became an excess of labor when that industry started to decline, and it became more of an information technology. People did need more education, but the people who wanted those jobs were already educated, and it was largely a whiter population who had access to better levels of education. So what do you do with an excess population? This is Michel Foucault's sociology, that when a country has excess populations, they literally have to find a way to kill them. I know that sounds harsh, but if you boil it down to the low gravy and get rid of all the academic language, what the sociology says is societies find ways to kill excess populations. And the prison was the way they decided to destroy African-American, first men, and then it spread out to even women. Well, education in the prison was a popular thing when Puritans and very religious people were in charge of our prison systems. As time moved on and we had more conservative ideas about corrections, you know, that pendulum that swings between punishment and rehabilitation. I don't use the word, so I always forget it. Rehabilitation. That's that pendulum keeps swinging, and the pendulum swang to punishment. And there was no programs in the prisons. There were riots at Attica, riots at San Quentin. All of that happened around the same time. And those riots caused an investment in certain places in education. So college programs from like the late 70s to 1994, they thrived in prisons across America. There were over 350 of them. And people weren't just getting vocational degrees, they were also studying history and philosophy and literature and developing their own critical thinking skills, developing think tanks at Greenhaven in New York that actually studied the neighborhoods people were coming from and going to prison. This is a long story, but you all have to know this history. You're the next generation of leaders in this movement, and the history matters. So when the people started thriving with that education, simultaneously, you had also thriving communities, because after the Kerner Commission and the investment in things like community block grants, community action programs, community centers, there was a burgeoning kind of middle class coming out of the Civil Rights Act. Black people were getting jobs as teachers, lawyers, doctors, social workers, and really integrating into our society in a different way. And the backlash against that was Richard Nixon and tough on crime, the war on drugs, the war on welfare, the war on Black people. And I say specifically Black people, not because other populations weren't affected, but the roots of this was about controlling Black bodies from the time of slavery. And that's why in 1994, they voted to remove Pell Grant eligibility from incarcerated students to get rid of those college programs, because it was becoming a source of power building. It's about power and control more than it is about education. And we were able to, and I'm talking hundreds of people across the country cared about this issue, but to slowly convince those who are the leaders in criminal justice reform that higher education needs to be the primary thing that we give back to these people who have been disenfranchised from education, from the economy, from voting. Education will take care of all of that. It's the foundation upon which a life is built. It took a long time to convince folks that we should go in that direction. They were focused on what? Housing, employment, substance abuse treatment. All very important, but not as important as education. So here we are now.
Right, and listen, I'm telling you, you did exactly, you delivered, right? I knew you would, right? You just took me through questions 1 through 5, right? and I'm not lying. I had the whole thing about, let me ask you about the connection between the uprising of Attica and the transatlantic slave trade, and you killed it, right? As to be expected. An ancestor and giant in this game, not in this game, in this path. So my next question is,
it's a game. So okay.
No, it's a game for some. It's a life for others, right?
Mm-hmm.
We attempt, like you talked about, turning organs into chitlins. We attempt to make a life of this bag of whatever we've been handed, right? So my question, you spoke about the process, about the buildup when you were talking about the 40 years of Reconstruction, right? And you were talking about, the constant, we didn't even mention like the economic rise in certain communities, right up like Black Wall Street, and then the destruction of that. But we talk about that there are these efforts, and if we look back, and that's why I think it's important, if we look back in history, there's evidence that we will do all right, right? If left alone, right? If given the resources. So, and like Plessy versus Ferguson was seen as a victory, and it was such a loss because it wasn't separate but equal. It was separate, and now mimic this and get something that we might call equal, but we needed equity at that point, right?
That's right.
So, in that realm of thinking, my next question is, what ways? So here's this victory, right? There's much to be done. Here's this victory with the restoration of Pell to be implemented in 2023. Some people are calling for a more immediate implementation, and some people are saying, no, we need the time to lay out transparency and oversight to be sure, right? So what ways do you see us appearing, given this victory? Now, you just talked about other victories, right? What ways do you see us appearing to be moving forward in one regard, but we have to be careful because we could also be moving backwards?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question, because we are very good at business, going back to business as usual, as though something cataclysmic hasn't happened. So just in the last 18 months, not that it wasn't always happening, but of course with technology, the George Floyd incident was just one of the most viscerally disturbing and traumatic incidents for Black people in our history, just because of the level of, it holds so much. You watch one human being literally snuff the life out of another with, like he was stepping on a freaking cockroach. It was just, I'm not gonna go there. While another Black man watched. And then in January, we have an insurrection, a literal insurrection with armed people who had signaled months before that they were capable of this because they were going to kidnap a governor who carried swastikas and nooses and white supremacy signs. And now we're having a discussion as though none of that matters, that it's not a real threat to America. But what is the threat to America is giving access to voting to Black people, access to education to Black people. So, and the trend I'm seeing with the implementation is huge contracts going to all white institutions, really large research institutions who are now being given contracts to do the research that tells us what implementation should look like. And here's why I struggle with this idea of we should implement faster. Fast isn't always good, because maybe if we slow down, we could convince philanthropy, we could convince our government to invest in community-based organizations that have been doing this work for decades, to ramp up, to have the capacity to handle the implementation on a national level, infused with the values and the outcomes that we want to see. Because the outcomes that we want to see run the gamut to, yeah, we want to see outcomes for the person who is just looking for straight up, path to employment. I'm not interested in, studying the classics. I'm not interested in philosophy or sociology. That's not me. That's fine. But we also want a path for those whose goal is, what I want? I want to be a professor. I want to teach at an HBCU. I want to write books. I want to do art. We want opportunity for everyone. And we know that the dominant culture doesn't see us as having that type of breadth and depth and capacity, or they do see us as having it, but if we have it, we're more of a threat to the status quo, because we're basically colonists. And what we're saying is we refuse to be colonized any longer.
Thank you. And look, we're running out of time. So we have a couple minutes, but I got to get this last one in, because a lot of times when we talk, we generally don't get to a call to action. So if you could give 1, 2, or 3, whatever suits your spirit, a call to action in this regard, like what you spoke about. What should the people be doing? What should I be doing? What should other folks be doing?
The trust is investing in you fellows to become the next voices advocating at the federal level, at the state level on these issues. Going forward, and I always said, and I actually just wrote somebody about this morning, I never focused on memorizing legislation and getting in the weeds of how you write policy. We have to be the ones to push the values conversation. We have to push the reckoning conversation, because this is all, for me, part of reckoning and reparations. We have to push that conversation that if you do this without thinking about how the impact is going to show up on the ground differently in Black communities than it shows up in white communities, then you are not honoring the history that you have not yet accounted for. You have an opportunity here to really repair some damage by allowing the community to demand what they need and what they want out of education, and to not hinder it by limiting people to still low-wage jobs, vocational only. Or the worst they could ever do is infiltrate all of the prisons with a bunch of tablets with some routine curriculum that people are just thumbing through and then passing some rudimentary test at the end of it and say that's an education. That is not an education. An education is dialogue. It is the conversations we're having right now. And our people deserve that. So we've got to fight against that all tablet proposition. We've got to fight against the for-profit preposition. And we've got to fight against white people who have been deciding from the beginning of time what pedagogy really is, what education really is, and inform them that there is a whole nother method of education called oral history and passing down the narrative. They should all read, they should have to read Clint Smith's book, how history is passed, how the story is passed, because education doesn't only come from one place and one group of people. So that's our job. The call to, I don't have a bill to give you or a legislator I need you to talk to. I need you to talk about values and about what we deserve and what we bring to this earth as a people in terms of contributions to society. And it's not all steeped in European pedagogy or Greek pedagogy.
Thank you. So our time is up. And And my heart is over. I can't wait to mute my video so I can let this one out right here. It's just lingering. But no, thank you. I'm so appreciative.
And I owe you a one-on-one. I just been busy, but I got you.
We both busy, and listen, I keep up with you from afar though. You can bet I can run it down to you. But thank you. So that ends our portion.
Thank you all for being so patient and waiting for me. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely worth the wait. Absolutely worth the wait. Thank you both. Thank you both for your time and your gems that you have just dropped for us and for the advocacy that you both have been doing for so long. Thank you both. And now I'll just really quickly transition us back to Bizzabo. So you'll go back to the link and hopefully the link that you still have open.
Kayla, you're muted.
You're muted.
I said my whole spiel and everything. So thank you both. Oh my gosh. Thank you both. We'll just transition back to Bizzabo. Thank you, Reverend Nixon. Thank you, William, for sharing so much of your stories, so much of your truths and all the gems that you dropped for all of us, for sure. We are incredibly grateful for your time and glad that we worked through the technical difficulties. I'm just here to transition us between sessions. I'm Kayla Elliott, the Director of Higher Ed Policy. So if you all want to transition back to Bizzabo, to that unique participant link that you have, we'll get started with our next session in about 2 minutes, giving everybody just enough time to transition over. So we'll get started talking about our next session on advocacy, hiring, and policy.